Hello everyone, today we talk about 14th and 15th century Germany, also called German history, the age of principalities or princely Germany. At least this is how it's sometimes called in the historiographical tradition that I checked in my own country. I don't know, there is surely a term in Germany that tells that better, but princely Germany is meant in this way because of something that we've actually been talking a lot in my videos. This the progressive fragmentation of the German monarchy following the extinction of the Hohenstaufen dynasty. So we are in the second half of the 13th century. So basically the 14th and 15th century, the 15th centuries are this stage into German history into which there was no central authority in practice, but just many princely dynasties that ruled more or less on regional basis, even though the actual political fragmentation of the German lands implied that the dominions of these seigneuries were very often scattered all over the country, just with a with a greater concentration in certain areas, and it really depends on the same seigneury and the same princely dynasty, and this is something we're gonna check out now. So normally, there is a medieval Germany playlist that I created that is getting also decently crowded, we can say. And I noticed that there are people who like medieval Germany. So if you want to get a bit of context, maybe just look also at other videos that I made that may explain better the background we're starting from, because I'm gonna discuss just from the 14th century. So there is all the second part of the 13th century that haven't really covered, not even in the videos that I made, but I hinted often at how the developments actually took place, especially the rise of the Habsburgs and all that occurred in that phase. Today we're gonna start from Henry VII, but just by by convention now, there is no particular reason. Henry VII was the one of the most powerful of these German dynasts. He was actually French by language and culture, Luxembourg being at the western border of the Holy Roman Empire. So the Holy Roman Empire was multi-ethnic in its own kind. It was mostly Germanic. Then it had central and northern Italy. It had the Kingdom of Bohemia and other Slavic lands. There were definitely French-speaking territories and even other territories, especially in the north, in the Baltic Sea, that were occupied by different ethnicities. And the concept of the empire was obviously being this multi-ethnic ecumenical empire, like the Roman one had been. Sometimes we think of the Holy Roman Empire as Germany, right? But it wasn't really like that. It was a broader political structure that really, in theory, did not care, at least in origin, about these borders. Also because when it was created, in practice, a proper modern national identity of Germany didn't exist. It was mostly a sum of certain Germanic areas. Mostly, it depends whether you want to count that from the Carolingian Empire, whether from Otto the First, which is it's usually the latter. And maybe I should make a clarification about that in some video, because I get lots of questions related to that, and I think it could be interesting to focus on. But let's say that Henry VII had become Holy Roman Emperor by making his actually ruinous campaign into Italy to be crowned. He basically had launched this after years of absence. He had relaunched the Mediterranean politics of the Germanic sovereigns. Let's call them in this way. And normally speaking, when we study Henry, this happened in the years in the second decade of the 14th century. And since Henry eventually died of malaria into Italy, his campaign was aborted because of that reason. And generally speaking, the imperial authority kept declining. Excuse me, I have to drink a little. Sorry about that. There is this general impression that his enterprise was anachronistic, right? Oh yeah, the empire didn't exist anymore. These dynasts weren't like the Hohenstaufen, they weren't really capable of representing an imperial authority. Well, it is true. If we are talking relatively to sheer size and influence, definitely Henry VII was as powerful as Frederick II or Frederick I. He was essentially a dynast that had actually the lack of eventually being part of this dynasty that acquired Bohemia and eventually rose as one of the most powerful principalities into Germany. And he wasn't a German, the king of all Germany, but who had been practically in the past. Because if you look at the past, of course, monarchical authority in Germany was stronger sometimes. But generally speaking, we remember the Germanic institutions were being notoriously weak in terms of centralization, and the same fact that the German monarchy was elective, and this is not something that was created in 1356 with the Golden Bull by Charles IV that we'll be seeing now today. That was just a sanctioning of a situation that had evolved into and strengthened towards that direction. But generally speaking, no German king had ever managed to extend his power all over the kingdom. And especially nobody nobody had would have done that in the future. The Holy Roman Empire, in this sense, was born in already with certain genetic faults that could have been reversed. Indeed, I'm one of those who believes that in the 12th century the Hohenstaufen could have, by abandoning their broader universal interests, might have actually quite easily concentrating their forces into Germany proper to have centralized German monarchy and having created a national monarchy in Germany just like in France or in England. Obviously, the German kingdom would have remained different in traditions and all, culturally speaking, even institutionally speaking, to the other more famous German monarchies, but creating a royal domain that was able to basically crush any resistance in the kingdom was a possibility, was a chance. I don't know how this would have been declined. This is just alternative history, I don't know how they could have made it to eventually sanction the dynastic succession, for instance, in a country that, culturally speaking, didn't accept that, had a kind of federal idea of this, which was also pretty advanced. I mean, we don't have to criticize the Holy Roman Empire for being basically a federal power, because that in turn developed a lot of civilization, also in terms of political theory, of culture, of literature, of many things that really still make up German identity, German culture today, and that are quite interesting to study also in relation with, for instance, Anglo-Saxon political tradition that is substantially similar, at least under some points of view. And that definitely represented an alternative even in when the Holy Roman Empire was cancelled by Napoleon, to the nation-state perspective. Even Napoleon, when invading Germany, he didn't basically abolish the local juridical particularism like he had done, I don't know, in Italy or in France in itself, even though he had not been the one, but he was the one who, with the Code Napoleon, brought that to the ultimate perfection, legally speaking. So with the state that is the only source of right in practice, there was indeed something revolutionary brought by the revolution in France. But there was another model, and back then that definitely saw a strengthening and a definitive settlement here in the 14th, especially in the 14th century. Then in the 15th, things started slowly to evolve toward another direction, but that's how it happened. And relative to Henry VII, I don't even remember where he came to this point. He actually achieved a freaking lot for the time. First of all, Henry VII's expedition into Italy was something very big. It put an end, militarily speaking, it put an end to the Angevin wealth predominance in the peninsula. Basically, the whole northern Italy at a point was compact under the Ghibelline rule. He allowed practically, I mean, he helped at least the Visconti and the La Scala dynasties to become, these practically imperial vicars for the empire, northern Italy, and therefore stemming the French, Angevin, and papal power from the south. He definitely he got a great defeat into Tuscany because he tried to put Florence under siege. Basically, he couldn't assault that. Couldn't assault the city, and he was obliged to retreat. There was epidemics spreading in his army, the factions, so his army just melted away. But when he came back to Pisa, he was able to put up a huge expedition once again, paid also by the Aragonese, but also simply with the support that he got from Germany and the Italian powers. And he was about to invade Naples, and there are chronicles that clearly state that if he had invaded the Angevin kingdom, at that point he might have as well overthrown the Angevins from there. And Sicily was Aragonese and already Ghibelline in this sense, so allied with Henry. So instead he died, and the whole thing was aborted. But just for saying that, it's not that because it went wrong it had necessarily to go wrong. And we don't know, we normally say, oh, with the death of the beheading of Conradin by Charles of Anjou in 1268, it was over. The Germans couldn't recover. The kingdom of Sicily was done. Well, actually, no. I mean, things could have really gone in a different, in a very different way. However, it is true that Henry VII's expedition was the last one of some, far from being anachronistic, was definitely the last big expedition that was the last big Romfahrt, like the Germans called it. So the expedition to Rome that was put up. Ludwig the Bavarian, Ludwig of Wittelsbach, who ruled from 1314 to 1346, actually launched another expedition in there, which was substantially smaller and basically was just fueled by the Italian Ghibellines, with because the emperor didn't have any resource practically. Even John and young Charles of Luxembourg went once again, but they basically remained just into northern Italy, trying to carve a lordship on their own, and instead that there was also failure. And once again, it was something just backed by certain contingencies related to local northern Italian um, um, northern Italian political situation. So basically, with especially already from the return of Ludwig of Bavaria into Germany, and then with Charles IV of Luxembourg that ruled after him from 1346 to 1378. Basically, the German rulers decided to split definitely the two universal powers, in the sense that they didn't try practically to continue their Italian journey and to try to subjugate the papacy and to impose their direct rule in there. And this in turn brought to the, we can say, complete or relative at least Germanization of the Holy Roman Empire. I say relatively because, as we said, in Bohemia there were still the Slavs. I mean, it was a Germanization in the sense that the empire basically shrank in terms of political and military range of activity just north of the Alps, even though there were, especially with northern Italy, still very strong contacts in terms, or even a military intervention at one point. The Milanese repelled, if I'm not wrong, Charles IV invasion at a time. And still, however, the German rulers sought a recognition of their title from the papacy, even though they at one point they had sanctioned that wasn't really necessary, or at least that the Italian crown wasn't really necessary to become emperors, which had been the case instead ever since Charles the Great. And especially the popes, in this sense, the popes were doing something similar, telling the truth. I mean, the Germans were withdrawing from Italy, but also the popes were ruling at this time from Avignon, in southern France, at the border between the Holy Roman Empire and the French Kingdom. And popes like John the 22nd, who was on Peter's soil from 1316 to 1334, and Benedict XII, that followed him from 1334 to 1342, attempted, mostly ideologically, because they didn't have any other military means to other political means. I mean, they had huge political means as popes, but they couldn't physically impose that more than politically or juridically speaking. They attempted basically to control the emperor's nomination, at least. And there was a very fierce ideological struggle between the two sides, because we are already essentially in humanism, at least between the popes, the Holy Roman Empire, Germany, and especially Italy. There was a lot of political theorization and at this time of juridical production. There was in great part a crystallization of the relative ideologies from one side and another. Ludwig the Bavarian famously protected the royalist Marsilius from Padua, who was this extremely skilled Italian jurist and political thinker who wrote the extremely famous Defensor Pacis, that is the defender of peace, literally, which was something extremely ideologically sharp, according to which basically the papal prerogatives were, in temporal terms, in secular terms, an usurpation. Everything that the popes owned in property was considered basically theft in terms of everything that pertained to the secular rule. And saying something like this at the time was like an atomic bomb in ideological terms, because nobody had ever ventured so far. I mean, even Dante, who had written just a few decades before, he was definitely resizing the papal prerogatives to the original ecclesiastical ones, and instead saying that the emperor had to be in charge of political and military affairs, but saying basically that every kind of papal temporal prerogative was theft, was something against God, and product of the Antichrist. It was something incredible. A reason for which also Marsilius was defended by, protected by Ludwig the Bavarian. And in the Defensor Pacis, Marsilius was essentially saying that the election of the German king had to was prerogative just of German princes, and this is what Ludwig the Bavarian affirmed quite clearly at the Diet of Reims in 1338. So this quite easy, quite clear, also politically speaking, juridical principle according to which the German politics had to belong to the Germans, not to the Pope. It wasn't nothing national in this sense. It was really the idea that since the empire was weak at this point, that any kind of external interferences had to be cut off, because that hadn't to be an excuse for anyone else to enter into German affairs. And by the way, at this time you have to think that the papacy was quite strongly tied to France, and France this time really resembled more an empire than Germany, that basically hadn't one, because it was just a patchwork of principalities, while France was a huge power, and only the 100 Years' War and the Black Death basically engulfed this power, preventing it from invading great parts of Europe, including Italy and Germany at the time, which instead they would have tried to do with the Wars of Italy 2 centuries after. So the Germans understood that their situation was pretty serious, and that the best way to strengthen their and to secure their power was to give a more orderly asset to their institutions. So they sanctioned that the King of Germany could be only elected by certain princes. This is something that de facto already existed, because the major German princes already participated to the election. Originally speaking, this had to be something of that really existed in Nuce, actually, in all the kingdoms of Western Europe. I mean, the idea that it was really the freemen that elected their king. This was present all over in England, in France, in Italy. Then things had obviously evolved into a very different way from their Germanic, from the originary Germanic ideal. But juridically speaking, which is what really mm, um, made the difference at this point, considering the great juridical production that we were remembering before, is that the king is there theoretically to protect the subject's rights. I mean, it's not there because he has to rule. He has to rule because there is a contract with this. So we usually have this idea of the Middle Ages with the king that arrived and commanded everyone. No, actually that's a modern, if not a contemporary thing. In the Middle Ages, there were kings because these kings derived their rights from obtained their rights from the voluntary cession from the subjects in order to for him to provide for their own defense. Then it's already, we can say, of course, royal power had always pushed for the idea that they were placed there by God, so that and there was a sort of higher sanction for their earthly power, but the juridical practice was actually quite different, and it really stemmed from this basic principle that was basically was really at the base of the all the juridical production before the Code Napoleon in 1804. I mean, the idea that in order to advocate a right as a king, you have to do something in exchange, and that has to be agreed, because theoretically every stand, every free man has a right that cannot be alienated in any other fashion. So the Germans at this point were pushing really on this theory, but what I wanted to say is that the origin, theoretically, every German prince or noble freeman theoretically could participate to the election of the king. This has always been ideal because left aside that it was impossible for and it would be impossible still today to have every single freeman to arrive and to decide who has to be elected in one place. Today we go to vote, we have a systematization of all this, and so we choose who has to be in charge. But and there are also other intermediate bodies that obviously the freemen had really never had much to say in terms of who had to be elected, if not as a broader force that, however, was guided by aristocracies, and it had always been the aristocracies that chose the king. And even when you read about those medieval German diets into which, I don't know, hundred if not thousands of knights, of noblemen participated to the election, it's not that they were voting, they were simply participating to an already agreed and already decided result of the election. Even though the elections could really be very difficult, because at the point into which the major aristocracies de facto became to regulate the German election, the disagreement between these within these aristocracies obviously meant that there were first of all, there might have been the kings might have not, the candidates might have not got the 50% plus one, and then all the others could simply wage war to the sovereign, or maybe find a different agreement. It was something very different and complicated. throughout the whole imperial history. But the important thing is that by 1356, with the Golden Bull of Charles IV, there was the formal institutional sanction that the elective rights belonged only to 7 electors, that in the history of the Holy Roman Empire would have even been increased at a point, were increased at the point, and at the time were the Count of the Palatinate and the Palatine Count, the Duke of Saxony, the King of Bohemia, the Marquis of Brandenburg, and that were the lay electors, and then the ecclesiastical electors that were the archbishops of Cologne, Trier, and Mainz. In practice, at this time, telling the truth, even Austria was pretty, pretty influential, and also even the sanction of these 7 electors didn't practically mean that these were the only guys that really decided how things went. But the institute and even this sanction wasn't really these electors weren't really even really sanctioned at this very time. I mean, this was just the first idea of how it had to be that was sanctioned, but eventually things got really evolved and were a little bit more complicated eventually. But in practice, there were also other powers that strongly influenced the outcomes of the elections. Also because, as you can see from the map, there were there was a freaking lot of other powers that could, simply oppose to politically, militarily speaking, to the election. So this 7 electors system was really theoretical in many ways. And German policy was really carried out also by many other parts that obviously sided usually with the major power, so ubi major minor cessat practically, but even Austria was left out, or Bavaria, that was quite important already at this time, or other smaller entities, including I don't know, Württemberg, or other ecclesiastical princes and all, were very important. But the really important thing is that they were all Germans in practice, aside from Bohemia, that however this time was ruled by Luxembourgs, and that so just for saying that it wasn't much about being German as a real nation in modern terms. Nazio in Latin means something really different, but it was something that gravitated around this Central European region, and that had to remain within there in terms of political direction and decision. And naturally imagine that this wasn't an isolated system. As I was saying before, there was France, there was the papacy, there were there was Poland, Hungary, England, a lot of powers that, and the Italian states that also were crucial for the support that could be achieved by certain German princes. That never really abandoned Italy. I mean, this went, for instance, in parallel with the Habsburg expansion, and the Habsburg expansion has always been strongly tied to Italy. So anyone who, say, wanted to go against the Habsburgs might have played over the Italian chessboard to win over certain lords, and it was really a very very complex system, and it was of continental breed, we can say. as basically all what was really happening in these two last centuries of the Middle Ages, because European society and economy were really already too developed to have to remain just within the borders of a region and not to have crucial interests coming from elsewhere. The other great thing that we hinted to before was that the imperial title could be now obtained without the crown of Italy and the papal approval. Even though in practice the papal approval was always necessary in some form, because the popes could simply say, if I don't recognize you, everybody's gonna go against you, so it's better if you do in some way. And they still had a great power. They controlled partly also the German church, obviously. And things were really, you can't really make a simplistic statement like that. And as we were saying, as an outcome of this, Germany remained divided into an ensemble of autonomous political entities, over which the emperor or the king exercised just a nominal power, largely. And this is very important because at a certain point, really, fragmentation was stopped, practically speaking. The greater phase of fragmentation of the empire had practically already taken place in the moment in which the Hohenstaufen evaporated, also because their domains were quite strong into Germany. So with their sunset, practically, they were the only base on which a centralized monarchy could develop wasn't there. So people say, oh yes, Germany fragmented even more. Left aside that really, in this sense, Germany was fragmenting even during the same Hohenstaufen in substantial measure. At one point, like Frederick II, at one point simply said, okay, I leave you as German princes to do what you wish in some measure, as long as you recognize me, or if you just give me a bit of money, and basically refusing all the other rights that were normally and traditionally owed to the imperial control. And this was obviously a very pragmatic thing to do, because it basically ensured at one point that these German princes wouldn't rebel in part. But there is another element I want to stress in this process, that is, although the German monarchy practically eclipsed for some time at least, there was and therefore a monarchical territorial construction wasn't there into the 14th and 15th centuries. There was, however, the construction of other domains. And because everything had literally jumped in terms of centralization, because the sovereigns didn't have fiscal incomes, they didn't have practically a body of functionaries or military forces that could ensure their control and administration of the kingdom. So the various German dynasties that in turn obtained the German crown and all, and fought constantly against each other, began to practically build these local principalities that were really most of the times they weren't really even neither a regional scale power. And we're talking usually about the Luxembourgs and the Habsburgs. Mm. But even in these dynasties, there weren't really many strong figures for many reasons. These two dynasties actually rose to power quite quickly and quite luckily. The Habsburgs made it because they managed to defeat Bohemia at one point and then taking in one block Austria, Styria, and Carinthia, and to rule it over together with their Swabian and domains. And they had actually a very considerable power in the second half of the 13th century, when eventually the Luxembourgs were called exactly by Bohemia, by the Bohemian nobility to counter the Habsburg influence. And what you can see even from this map is that excuse me, really the greater territorial concentration was exactly here into the eastern part of Germany, in the southeastern part, with Bohemia and Austria that made up this the greater contiguous and extensional domains into Germany proper. Also, Bavaria wasn't that bad. Saxony and Meissen had some power. Here you see Brandenburg, but if you look at the Rhine Valley, it's all really fragmented. There isn't really this was mostly the territories of the archbishops that ruled over the rich cities of the Rhine, of the Main, and of the of Münster, of Friesland, and all. But so this just for saying that it's not really a matter of the absence of great rulers that could have achieved who knows what, because it was really the base that was pretty fractioned. The Habsburgs, by the way, even grow weaker because they split up into lines. So basically, before the end of the 15th century, they didn't reunite over their dominions, and they were weaker, and they could achieve practically much less until basically 1519, and when Charles of Habsburg, known as Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, began to give a bit more of concreteness to the imperial power, but also because he had inherited huge domains, including Spain, the Americas, and even though it had been exactly their Frederick III and Maximilian I were his great grandfather and grandfather respectively, that had managed to obtain, for instance, the Flanders, basically the Flemish inheritance of the Burgundy, the Burgundian Valois, through marriage policies and all. But Austria in itself, let's say that before the mid of the 18th century, wasn't really a great power. They were quite influential indeed. They were the most they rose up to be the most powerful dynasty from the 16th century, at least the late 15th into Germany. And during the 30 Years' War, they definitely were about to gain to regain a greater power, and possibly even reunifying Germany. A bit complex, but it was feasible in some measure. Yet that discontented evidently too many, and things were reversed. So there was really the impossibility of creating something greater. And the political structures were really too weak to achieve that at the time. Even though we must say that Germany was quite advanced as a country at the time, like by the 16th century, Germany and Italy were the most advanced nations of the world, technologically speaking, in terms of you know the German communities were pretty well organized, and they had retained this ability essentially because of their federal status, because they said, we mind about our own business as subjects of the Holy Roman Empire, as German freemen in practice. And they had managed, even though if it was, they weren't freemen in the sense that there were really aristocracies ruling them, princes, as we're talking about today. But from the princely perspective, that was the theory. I have this originary German freedom, therefore I can waive that when the emperor is gonna force me to give up some of my rights. So it was really all fought over these compromises between a timid attempt of centralization of the federal of the imperial institutions that were still out there. The Habsburgs worked a lot to create, for instance, the if I'm not it was wrong, it was the Reichskammergericht, so a greater tribunal that had to deal, much really passed through justice at this point, because if you can't do that politically and militarily speaking, which was done anyway, exercising justice is always a good way to make money, because of the rights deriving from that service. So it was something really important in this perspective. The Let's say that the state building, however, as was hinting before, was starting from the bottom. So all the state of power that existed in Germany was starting within the same Länder, that are regional or even sub-regional areas that comprehended cities and seigneurial estates, and that were under the power of these principes terre, so these princes of the land. Land in German is something that is charged with even with greater meanings that land in England, in English, sorry. It really stresses the importance of the territorial rooting of certain communities, of their prerogatives, their rights, their traditions, their political organizations, their autonomy in practice. So these Länder presented an extension and a different degree of extension and institutional development. As I was saying, the southern region, especially the one ruled by the Habsburgs at the end of the 15th century, were more advanced in this state building process. Also because they became to encompass other lands that had a greater form of centralization, like for instance Bohemia was partly more centralized than the other Germanic lands. This is a very complicated thing, actually, to explain, and the same can be said for Hungary. Actually, these were all elective monarchies as well, but they had come from a different tradition, and they were relatively easier to rule in centralized fashion than Germany, at least. Not that they were solidly centralized, but they at least had they were more universally oriented, in the sense that they responded to a greater tradition of unitary tradition. Since the Przemyslids and the Arpads, respectively in Bohemia and Hungary, had set, historically speaking, a unitary tradition that was much stronger than the one of Germany. And also because of feudalism, because German feudalism had kind of complicated partly the world picture, because from one side feudalism had allowed to create a concentration of power on the hands of fewer people, but at the same time these people had not allowed the forward step towards centralization. Feudalism was present also in Bohemia and in Hungary, of course, but it had been more timid. It had expanded later in there. It was a more progressive thing. Um, so in some ways, these lands were more centralized. And by the way, there is no. It's not surprising that the Habsburgs really expanded more towards those directions than the center of Germany proper, because they, especially through dynastic marriages, they could inherit in block a whole kingdom instead than a patchwork of singular principalities, which was also done, by the way, naturally, but the marriage policies at this point were, marry the the daughter of the bigger guy, so that you can inherit that um, if you're lucky enough. And that's how the Habsburgs won over Spain, by the way, without being definitely as powerful as Castilla or Aragon, maybe as Aragon a little. No, well, Aragon actually had Naples, Sicily, Sardinia. No, it was bigger. I was just thinking about Spanish Aragonese domains. But just for saying that through marriage policies, they rose to an unprecedented power in Europe. Charles V was really, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, and relatively to this, it's interesting to think that, I don't know, if that marriage had not happened, or if they hadn't had children, things could have been really much different in the history of. Just think, I don't know, also in other contexts, I don't know if Philip II of Spain or Mary Tudor had children. Well, that would have really changed history radically. I mean, there would have been another another historical situation. Yeah, and there is the famous, in fact, the famous motto of the Habsburgs that sounds. I'm searching for it in Latin. It's fantastic. That says. Bella gerunt ali, tu Felix Austria nube, namque Mars alis dat tibi diva Venus, which means, let, let others wage wars, and instead you, happy Austria, marry. And in fact, those that which that Mars gives to others, to you is given by the goddess Venus, and this was seemingly something already existing at the time of Maximilian I. That was actually the guy who managed to make his son marrying with the heiress of Castilla and Aragon. And it really tells it all about how important marriage policies are at this time. But going back to Germany, what I want to say is that the eastern part, the eastern half, say, what is important about Germany to stress is also that there was never really a frontier in Germany. I mean, it was really complicated to say, where does really the empire stops, because there are many different peoples, many different even geographical areas, And historically speaking, you can argue that the Germans were also more warlike exactly because of this, because there wasn't really a border, something that, think about the Slavs, all the warfare that existed between the Germans and the Slavs at one point. It was complicated. There are not really very marked barriers. So it was easier, probably even, to expand in the east. In the west, instead, in the western half of the Holy Roman Empire, the Länder were much smaller. Mm. The ones that developed between the Elbe and the Rhine rivers had a much greater political fragmentation, and this partly depended also on the fact that probably they were richer than in the East, which is kind of strange, but it's actually true. I mean, if there are several, I mean, where there is more wealth, if there is not already something well centralized at the origin, there is you're gonna meet much more resistance locally speaking. So, for instance, all the cities that were present along the Rhine, those were usually absorbed in Germany by the local bishops. Some made it to be free city-states, but they never rose to the degree of autonomy or nor even the political military capacities of, say, I don't know, the Italian cities. But as small entities, they kind of defended their own, and they kind of prevented the bigger guy to expand it there, and made it more difficult, made it more complicated. There were much more traditions to infringe, much more communities to disturb for doing something like that. Taking in one block, I don't know, the Kingdom of Hungary or the Kingdom of Bohemia, which was something much more profitable, much easier to do, and relatively also because that wasn't really there was even there the aristocracies were always split up and all, but the fact there was less economical potential in the East probably made this development to be greater. Even Brandenburg, if you think about it, which was definitely a poor area in Germany, and it was still, I mean, it is still today in practice compared to the other German regions. Yet it was one place into which the Hohenzollern made it to kind of build up a solid domain and to eventually centralize in the 18th century, from the end of the 17th and then during the 18th century, from the fact that basically their land only belonged to landed aristocracy, the Junker, and there weren't other fiercely autonomous communities to curb in there. It's not that aristocracies are tougher to curb, but at least they are easier to co-opt because they have a they first of all they already control in turn greater parts of lands, great parts of communities. So the best thing you can do is to engage them, to give them, you know, a little share of your achievements, and they will follow you at least at a certain point. It can still be risky, but they can also support you in this sense. Then, in this sense, it's very interesting to see what happened in southern Germany relatively to the rise of the Swiss Confederation, which is exactly these Western communities that rose against an Eastern one, like the one of the Habsburgs, that was more feudal in its characteristics. So the history of Switzerland is amazing. If you ever want to learn more about, I will definitely make a more detailed video, and especially a dedicated one on the Swiss Confederation. Hopefully, also we'll talk about the Swiss military during the 14th and 15th century. That is so very important. But to make the long story short, I think the name was something like this Eidgenossenschaft, and it was born as a federal pact in 1291, namely, at the time there were basically it was a mutual pact for reciprocal defense, made up by these three mountain cantons that are close to the Luzern lake, Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden. And these lands, originally speaking, were developing because, with the reprisal of trade during the 13th century, with the opening of new ways towards the south, it was the same Hohenstaufen that actually granted rights to them on the Alpine passes, and that began relatively timidly to expand. I mean, they didn't have a huge economical potential like, I don't know, the Flemish cities, but their luck was that they lived in heavily mountained areas, so that they were difficult to penetrate, strategically speaking, by invaders. So they kind of combined the two things. And this helped them also, tactically speaking, when they had to defend their passes and all. Was much easier to be at the top than those who came from the below. And these lands, however, as lands of the Duchy of Swabia, practically, belonged originally to the Habsburgs, that after the Hohenstaufen had expanded into Swabia themselves. They were a bit the heirs of the region. Actually, the Habsburg lands are mostly in Alsace, and today's Alsace and Switzerland, so exactly in these areas. There were also Swiss knights that contributed to the Habsburg victory at the Battle of Markfeld in 1278 against the Bohemians. So Switzerland was fully part of the feudal, Germanic system that existed in there, and with the economical development of these cantons, they created a league. And there was originally not at all anything revolutionary or subversive, like they weren't really even thinking of themselves to be independent Swiss, like, I don't know, modern Swiss could think today. They were simply Germans who decided to make a Landfried. The Landfried was the pacification of the land. It was an institutionally, a normal, I don't know how to say that, something that could be carried out institutionally, usually by the kings, to pacify, usually against the aristocratic feuds, and these local populations that were versed in trade and all, with the eclipse of the monarchic authority, began to basically use them on their own, to claim a Landfried on their own against those who wanted to impose their pressure on them. And usually were the nobles, the aristocrats. The Swiss were at this point largely commoners. And they had commoner armies, infantry armies and all. So between the 14th and 15th century, practically they expanded rapidly, a bit. Usually the enemy was the Habsburgs, who tried more than once to repress them, to conquer their territories back, because they were theirs, really by right, and they were practically defeated time after time by the Swiss infantry. So these feudal armies of the Habsburgs defeated by the commoners, the Swiss commoners. And the Swiss began to expand even elsewhere. Like they kicked out, for instance, the Savoy rulers from the Lake of Lausanne. They even had intense fight with the Visconti dynasty, with alternating fortunes, let's say, but they managed to practically win over their freedom. They included a greater amount of cities eventually, time after time. There's also a timeline that shows you that. They included Luzern, Zurich, Zug, Glarus, Bern, in 14th century, and then in 15th also Soletta and Freiburg. With the Treaty of Basel of 1499, basically the Emperor Maximilian of Habsburg was obliged to recognize their independence, which was a great achievement indeed in perspective. But it also was quite of a progressive thing. Also here it could have been reversed in the mess that Germany was at the time. Even though the political territorial fragmentation and the institutional fragility of the empire didn't allow a unitary entity to form into this Central European region. This didn't prevent the Germans to mature a sort of national ideology. And this is something that I was hinting at before. I mean, when those political acts that de facto sanctioned the inconsistency of central power and the preeminence of the princes, like the declaration of Ludwig the Bavarian in 1338, the Diet of Reims, and the Golden Bull of 1356. There was behind that the reivindication of the Germanic root of their political authority. So they were saying, okay, there is not a strong sovereign, but we're doing that because we're really preserving our own rights. And if you think about it, Germany, although weak and fragmented, it kind of became also the battleground of Europe during the 17th, even the 16th. I mean, Germany was really a mess, but no foreigner practically achieved to rule in there. Yes, there were several influences from Spain, from France, from even from, I don't know, from Sweden. But in practice, this Central European, from England as well, in parts, even if that was a bit different. But these lands were not really invaded permanently. I mean, they weren't conquered by a major foreign force. There were armies definitely sweeping and pillaging and destroying and slaughtering and all, but at the end of the day, those lands remained German, because I'm not really making a nationalist praise in here. I'm just stressing that probably the system that that was sanctioned during the 14th and 15th century helped this monstrous group of literally hundreds of princely states to remain something too difficult to digest, even for the bigger powers. And definitely there were also other areas of the world, even at that point, that were more profitable for expansion and all. So this kind of saved Germany in part, as if they had been a unitary kingdom, they might have maybe suffered more at some point of external influence, or maybe, I don't know, they would have turned themselves into conquerors, because evidently when Germany was unified, it began to launch invasions after invasion, like French-Prussian War, World War I, World War II. I mean, they were all done to basically avoid that the Germans would conquer everything. And this is also interesting to think that an area that was so politically weak and like Germany for the world modern era basically turned into this major continental hegemonic force like Germany during the late 19th and the 20th century is very meaningful to me, and I'm not aware much of of Germany's historiography relatively to this. Also because of National Socialism and all the reaction to it, Germans are quite, you know, wise not to stress these things again too much. But I think that there are connections between these two things, and they should probably be understood better. At least I would like to understand them better. And I would like to conclude by stressing also another aspect that maybe makes better understand how the political fragmentation of Germany basically came to be a sort of an a means to strengthen the German identity. Is that in 1440 we have the first denomination of Holy Roman Empire of the Germanic nation. Or the German nation, that basically stresses how the concept of nation was a sort of fundamental element of power in Germany, or at that time. I think the term Holy Roman Empire is something that starts appearing from the time of Barbarossa, so in the 12th century. Before, I think it was just Roman Empire, simply as that. And the eventually it became in the 40s of the 15th century Holy Roman Empire of the Germanic nation, to stress exactly this, which is, you know, in terms of ideologies, I mean, it's something so controversial as much as the political fragmentation of the German lands. But I think that it's really in here that it lays the key for understanding this system and really how it was characterized. In this sense, and it's kind of a unique thing in the history of the world, if you think about it, because I can't think historically speaking. I don't know, maybe in Asia it was something similar, but I really don't believe so. I mean, this was something chiefly Germanic, as chiefly German. Maybe just Italy, but Italy was much less fragmented than this. Like when in these times, like in Germany, there were like 300 states. In Italy, there were maybe 30. So, and the Italians had actually pushed to a greater, to the construction at least of certain regional states of very strong power. Also, the Germans, but as we've seen, mostly in the southeastern part. While the rest of Germany was extremely more fragmented than Italy, so I don't think that it's fitting. And especially in Italy, there wasn't a federative culture in this sense. I mean, at one point it was recognized even as a sort of necessity, but in practice, the problem with the Italian states is that they were so singularly powerful on their own that they didn't want to give up their own individual force for someone else. And this is partly what the Germans did, but because they were too weak individually to wage their own policy. And in this sense, the major German princes resembled more the Italian lords in this sense, because they were trying at least to build something more unitary. Also consider that Italy had many more cities. We said that, and that the Italian lordships were largely city-based, while the German principalities were mostly based on land estates. I mean, even the concept of a capital was something very late in time that arrived. Like for the Habsburgs, Vienna wasn't really the capital until very late into the modern age. There was a completely different. I don't know. Maybe if you followed my videos, you probably realized that I talk mostly about Italy and Germany for the Middle Ages, and the reason is that I find an extreme interesting comparison between the two areas, not just during the Middle Ages but also in the modern age. And because they were in fact part of the same Holy Roman Empire, and they also interact pretty much with each other in this sense. I mean, even when during the wars of Italy, when the empire kind of came back from the Austrian and Spanish side, let's say, of the Habsburgs, there was a sort of revival of the. I mean, the Italians actually dwelled pretty and participated quite strongly to the Holy Roman Empire in terms of career and opportunities during the modern age. Like some of the greatest military commanders during the 30 Years' War were actually Italian, and they felt themselves as part of an empire, really, especially especially in northern Italy. Think about people like, I don't know, Montecuccoli, or that were more strictly tied to the Austrian part, because usually the Italians made military career into the Spanish branch. But eventually with Austria it was a strict relation. Even the Prince Eugene of Savoy, that was really a Savoy, so he was actually half Italian and half French. He was mostly French, culturally speaking. Even though he didn't perceive as that, he would have conceived himself as simply Savoy Carignano, as he was. But for saying that, this idea of the Holy Roman Empire was something that really survived much longer than we think, and I can't say I'm a fan in itself of the Holy Roman Empire, but because I don't care, especially when I talk about these things, I always try to be neutral in some fashion. I actually like it. I'm a Ghibellin, I can't say, but no, I'm kidding here. But I mean, it was really. I'm really annoyed when people really say, "Ah, the Holy Roman Empire was such a stupid thing, such an anachronistic stuff." Well, it really wasn't. It was simply another way of looking at the world. It was mostly a Germanic federative political tradition that really made, as I was saying before, also very strong. Obtain also great civilization achievements, and it has to be understood, it has to be studied. I realized that people don't talk much about these issues, these topics, but whatever. The video is extremely long. If you like it, please share it, otherwise leave a like or just subscribe to my channel for receiving further news about my contents. And for now, I just thank you heartily if you had the patience to listen to me for all this time, and I thank you once again. And I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.